Okay.
Perfect. And thank you so much for being here and sharing sharing your thoughts and your research. Super appreciative of your time.
I think I may be one of the only people actually in the building.
Oh, wow.
Is that where you are?
I'm in the courtyard, yeah.
Oh. I was like, I thought you were like in Columbus, Ohio, somewhere modernist.
No, no, no. I'm in the courtyard. Yeah.
Nice.
Better enjoy it before everything changes.
I guess a final question, so I was part of this response group. We're thinking about like the counter arguments, and Evan refers to this idea.
Okay. Great.
Jacob, you give me the signal and let me know.
Yeah, I think Anya's going to give a short intro. Maybe we wait one more minute, but I think we could just get going because we're recording.
Yeah,
And,
I can kick this off. I just
before you do, Anya, Jacob or Anya, can you give me screen sharing privilege?
Yes, just did.
Okay. So Harley, this is going to be extremely informal in terms of an introduction, but I just wanted to take a pause to sing your accolades and just share a few words of appreciation that you're joining us today and sharing your knowledge and your expertise. We are in a virtual room with many architects and happily some planning students, and delighted to have urban design students in the mix. And in many ways, your scholarship and contribution to the college really bridges between our programs in very meaningful ways. And it's always just a delight to, especially from the perspective of an architecture faculty member, to get your insight and your critical sensibility and your capacity to read context and understand policy and inflect the way that we see the built environment. It's always been such a delight to have you in conversation and to have you guide our understanding of our disciplines. So Harley, thank you for joining us. I know we've given you a prompt to help us understand communities and contexts across these disciplines that are all involved in this collective experiment. So without any further ado, welcome to UM Public Design Corps Summer 2021 with this unprecedented team of faculty, mentors, colleagues, students who are working on 8 different projects in Michigan and beyond. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anya. Very generous introduction. I do want to acknowledge, I see a couple of my planning colleagues, Maria, Rob, Joe, and Paula. So thank you for coming as well. And nice to see my architecture colleagues here too. So thank you for that. I also see some of my students from past semesters. So it's nice. I think I saw Sarai here a little earlier. So nice to see you too. So I will just add a little bit to what Anya just said. So I teach in the area of neighborhood planning and community development in the urban regional planning program here at Taubman. And over the years, this course, my neighborhood planning course, which is one of my flagship courses, has really used to attract mostly planning and social work students. And I now get lots of architecture students in that class as well. And so Anya is correct. It does kind of blur the lines between them. And I would say urban design becomes kind of one of the bridges through which we can think about how planning and architecture are connected. But I want to offer a couple definitions and things that just some takeaways that when I teach on the topic of community to my students, I hope that they just leave with at least these particular concepts. So let me share my screen. And I'm sorry that I am, oops, go back to the beginning. So this is probably one of the most important kind of money slides, I guess you could call it here. A lot of people use the words community and neighborhood interchangeably. And for me and a lot of people who write and think about this, they're very different things. And so we can think of communities as these aggregations of people who have common identities, histories, shared interests, social connections, that they aren't necessarily place-based. And that you can live in a community of people. You can live in a space with other people and not be in community with them. But it is indeed a neighborhood. And to think specifically about neighborhoods is that they're place-based aggregations of homes, institutions, firms, natural areas, and that you may or may not have natural boundaries, highways, rivers, creeks, train tracks, things like that, that separate one neighborhood from another. Sometimes those things are administrative, defined by a city, government, or other entity, and so they're kind of imagined. We can't quite see them, but they're still physical things or physical artifacts. And so this becomes really important. So sometimes when I know some of you are working on projects where you're trying to understand how one neighborhood ends and where it begins, this becomes a real challenge because we can think about census tracts and kind of data, and those are things defined by the Census Bureau. And so they don't always correspond to how people actually experience those spaces. And so often what I try to do, and I don't always have the time to do this as well as I'd like to, which is to have residents actually tell me themselves what the neighborhoods are, and then try to kind of see how that matches up with government data to make sure that it fits. But this is a difficult thing. In planning, we often kind of draw this other distinction between neighborhood planning versus community development. And this is also the other very important thing. When we talk about neighborhood planning, we can think about something that neighborhood planners who work for a city government, a county, other organization do to and for a neighborhood, versus community development, which is really coming ground up from the residents themselves. That doesn't mean that people, planners, designers who work for a city aren't concerned with community empowerment and development in a particular way, but often that's not what their job entails. Their job entails helping the city understand what's going on there and solve problems through policy in a neighborhood, versus community residents actually having control over their future. And having some actual agency and being able to assert that. And so that is probably, if you take nothing else away from me, to drop off the call, I want you to leave with that thing in particular. And that this is something that we often don't do, is how do we actually empower people to control their story and control the future of their communities and their neighborhoods. And that's not something that our current structure actually does well. And so we have to think about things like community organizing and how to actually get people together to increase their capacity as a community. And that blurs into what that could mean and the implications for neighborhoods. So one of the context pieces here is thinking about the urban designer Clarence Perry and the way that he tried to create this neighborhood ideal of like what would be the ideal neighborhood form. So I think this is something that may speak to the architect's hearts here. That this footprint that you can see here really shows what he intended, and so that you'd have this neighborhood school at the center of this community, and that you'd have no more than 5,000 people in a neighborhood. And that school would service the entire area, and that you would have some bounded area by these arterial roads kind of at the outskirts, and this Baroque kind of street design kind of running through it, cul-de-sacs and things like that. So this is not, I wouldn't kind of see this and say this is a precursor to our modern subdivisions, but in some senses, this is, kind of an early form of what I would say many developers have bastardized over the years and turned into subdivisions, because they often don't have all the things that Perry had in his model. The dark side of his model, though, is that he really wanted to use this tabula rasa model, not in the suburbs, but in the city itself. And that he wanted to create these racially homogenous neighborhoods to kind of eliminate, as cities began to diversify in the 20th century, he really wanted them to become this racially homogenous set of communities. And so if we could kind of clear neighborhoods, eliminate kind of row homes, townhomes, things like that, and actually create the community that this ideal shape, that we could do it in this way by actually doing this. And so I want to connect this specifically, I'm sorry for the graininess of this image, I'm borrowing this from another lecture I've given over the years, Seaside and New Urbanism, that there's some kind of connections in the design between, I'll just go between the two, between Perry's design and what we can often find in New Urbanism. And so the reason why I want to draw this connection for people is that sometimes New Urbanism, we don't critique it harshly enough or rigorously enough to consider it in the ways in which this is this romantic romanticized notion of neighborhood. And so I think for a lot of people who work in neighborhoods and even in Detroit, so that we kind of actually assess neighborhoods based on their quality using these neighborhood ideals that we're not really clear on where they came from, and then apply them to neighborhoods in Detroit and say, hey, this neighborhood is dysfunctional because it doesn't look like this ideal. It's incorrect, and it's not fair or accurate to do so. And so there's some ways to understand how neighborhoods can be different based on their location, based on their history, their geography, topography. There are lots of reasons why all neighborhoods shouldn't look this way. And we should understand them as a part of a larger network of neighborhoods within a region, within a city, a region, and a marketplace. These are all embedded in a very complex web of economic relationships, banks, governments, individuals, that really make neighborhoods what they are. And so to not understand just the current structures that govern how they're shaped, but also their historical things that have shaped how they come together, then we begin to understand things a little bit differently. So I want to make an argument for why you should care about neighborhood community development, not neighborhood planning. And so in some ways, this is one of the few areas of planning, and I hope none of my planning colleagues take offense to this, that we're really focused very much on how do we actually empower people to have some control, understand what's actually shaping their particular community, and how can they do something about it? How can we empower them to do something about it? Versus always deferring to technical experts, government employed planners to do that work for them. And so I appreciate that about that. But here's the downside to this. That community engagement that allows us to partner with communities takes a long time because there's often lots of trauma, there's lots of history, there's lots of distrust of community, of government planners, of external kind of actors who are coming into a scene who really want to come in and have a win. They want to build a supermarket, they want to build a strip mall, they want to build the housing and kind of move on, versus how do we do the long-term engagement that really actually gets to know people, really empowers them with information, with process, with understanding the structures that they're operating within. That's difficult. And so engagement probably isn't even the right word either, because it really is in some ways more partnership than just engagement. Engagement can be hollow and it can be really shallow in some ways, that it is about building relationships. And so sometimes I still maintain, sorry for the noise, planes flying overhead. I still maintain some relationships with people that I've worked on projects with in Atlanta. I've tried to maintain relationships with people in Detroit, but it's a lot of time. And sometimes they move on and want to do things differently, and I have to move on because I'm taking on new projects. But you have to maintain some of those relationships because the job's not done. There's still a lot of need for help, technical expertise, and for that long-term engagement that actually helps work against the mistrust that people have developed over the years. I'll talk about the Michigan piece of this in a second. This is one of the things that I think is also important, that we often don't understand how political planning is, and that's a part of why this is so difficult, because these relationships, people's tensions with the cities, their tensions with their neighbors, with neighboring communities, it's political. That there are all of these power relationships between one community and another. And so you have to understand the ways in which planning is about these local tensions and histories. One of the papers that I'm finishing with a doctoral student right now talks about this tension between Indian Village, West Village, and the neighborhoods around it. And the ways in which this kind of neighborhood change and gentrification is actually causing this real rift between the two. And you can feel this hegemony between this historic neighborhood of Indian Village kind of against these other neighborhoods that are really trying to coexist with them, but can't because of the ways in which those neighborhoods kind of actually are positioned and interact with one another. So here's this other piece of this. And I'll talk about this a little bit in a second. One of the primary ways in which community development happens is through community-based organizations. And so I'll define this in a second. But that we have organizations that operate outside of the government and its apparatus, that you have these organizations that are really created by community members for their own benefit, for their own development. And they can be CDCs, they can be other neighborhood-based organizations like neighborhood associations, but their effort is to bring people together and come up with long-term plans and kind of problem-solving orientations for their communities. The problem is that in this environment that we have of increasing globalization and neoliberalism, it's difficult to have as much control as we'd like over our local communities because there's so many things kind of going on. So I'll just give you one example. If we have a neighborhood, anywhere, could be Ann Arbor, Detroit, where have you, and that we're all very interested in making sure that neighborhood's safe and clean, has the services that it needs in terms of trash collection, police protection, that comment on that later. There's something to be said for, can you control what interest rates, a change in interest rates will do to this kind of speculation that will come in and change prices? Do we have control over what the demand for housing will be in a particular neighborhood based on things that have nothing to do with us and whatever CBO might decide to do? And so this becomes one of the tensions, which is, our CBOs, how effective can they be given all the things that they're actually facing? And so I just want to kind of, as a footnote, it's difficult to think about neighborhood planning or community development in a way that ignores all those other things and the ways in which we have to think about the national context and even global context of the work that we try to do in neighborhoods. So one other thing to mention is that there is another kind of sub-split here, in that we can think about two different things. And I want to make the argument that both are important here. We actually not create a hierarchy between the two. There's community development, which is really more broad and thinks about the development of a community kind of more broadly. And there's community economic development that does something a little bit more specific when we're thinking about jobs, when we're thinking about economic opportunities, either within or adjacent to or connected in a regional level that connects people in a neighborhood to other things, financial capital in particular. The reason why this becomes important is that if we don't have financial capital, people don't have jobs, they don't have access to things in capital to start businesses, it becomes really difficult to think about how a neighborhood or a community can sustain itself over time without that piece of it. And so it's great if people are connected. It's great if we have a CBO that's really effective in doing things, but there has to be some capital in the mix. And so either we're dependent on foundations or the city or other people to bring money in to help us do things, or we have to have people who have their own businesses or jobs that actually empower them, give them the money that will help circulate within a community to kind of make things happen. And so this is where kind of things like workforce development becomes important. Workforce development is not something that a lot of planners talk about or think about, some do, but it's maybe when we think about communities and neighborhoods, it's something that we don't talk about enough. In that what made Detroit what it became in the first half of the 20th century was work. That lots of people had access to well-paying, very accessible work. You didn't have to have a college degree to work at Ford or GM or Dodge, and that actually enabled kind of this upward mobility for thousands of people and helped sustain and create neighborhoods and sustain them. When that kind of contraction happens, we have economic restructuring, you don't have that anymore. And so in some ways, these things have to work in tandem, that we think about both how do we get people together to kind of think about the long range future of the community, but also the economic part as well. So I'm just going to put this here. I don't have time to go through all of this, but I do want to just kind of put a footnote here. Organizing is something that I think when I have social work students in the class, they're very interested in, and other people are not as much. And I'm going to throw my planning students into this. Some of them are, but they're really kind of two different kind of main pillars here that we can think about community organizing. One of them is on this long-term development model. Like, how do we actually kind of get the community together to create create and enhance its collective capacity to solve problems and to kind of think about long-term planning and development. Another is a little bit more issue-based, a lot more issue-based, which is how do we organize people around a particular issue? We're really angry that the city has not picked up our trash. We're really angry that things are unsafe. We're really unhappy that the schools are in our community are in poor condition, and that we can mobilize people in different ways. And so they're both expensive in terms of time and effort. One focuses much more on the long term, and one much more, it's sometimes easier to mobilize people who have really strong feelings about something that's immediate to them. They can say, yes, I really would love my trash to get collected. I'm paying taxes. I wish the city was doing this. Why aren't they? And people can kind of get together around that. The IF model that I have here on the bottom kind of actually blurs some of what I just talked about in terms of community economic development with that kind of issue-based organizing, which is how do we actually understand workers and residents as overlapping groups, and that they may have a deeper connection, not just because they live together or live near each other or live in neighborhoods that are similar, but also because they also do similar kinds of work. And then we can kind of this double kind of barrel approach to organizing that thinks about people's lives a little bit more holistically. So, sorry, and the ACORN model, I'm sorry, I forgot to click. ACORN is defunct now, and so a lot of people know words, left in tatters after some of the challenges of the past 2 decades and attacks from the right on its model. But it mixes some of this, and ACORN really, in its heyday, was really great at thinking at the neighborhood level and the city level in most of the most distressed and challenged neighborhoods in cities, and did a great job of kind of doing that real kind of hardcore organizing that was very needed to sustain neighborhoods. So I mentioned that I was going to say something about different types of CBOs. And so, of course, this is not all of the types of CBOs, but I'm just giving you three big buckets that I like to kind of think about. CDCs are the biggest ones. And so just a quick history lesson. After the urban rebellions of the late 1960s, many communities decided, hey, we're not going to wait for the city or other planners to come in here and help us rebuild. We're going to take this up ourselves. And so one of the first CDCs that ever existed started in the Huff neighborhood in Cleveland. And you can see now, kind of, 50 years later, Cleveland's network of CDCs are among the strongest in the country because they really did buy into this model that we can control the future of our cities. And some of those CDCs and the network that they are embedded in is actually still very strong. You can really see them as something that belongs to the people. This is really a very flat description of this, because it's a little more complicated than this, and that there are these splits and kind of schisms between different types of community development corporations now. Some saying, no, we're just development organizations. We're not really doing the community thing as much. We're really just real estate development, nonprofit real estate developers. And others are like, no, this is really about community, and we're okay if we don't build 50 new units of housing every year. And so they're challenging. And there are reasons why there are these schisms between them. But then we have this other level, which is a little bit less formal. And I should mention with CDCs, these are incorporated organizations. They're filing 990s. They're following IRS tax rules. They're bringing in money. They have board of directors. They're pretty formal. And over time, they become much more formal as they employ planners, sometimes often students and graduates of our program, to help them with their long-term planning and development. Neighborhood stations are a little bit more informal. You can think about neighborhood organizations, block clubs, other things, where people are just getting together and doing things like garden clubs, or they're getting together to do a very small scale things. And sometimes they are doing neighborhood planning, but I would say these are kind of the most common that you might find around. CDCs are not everywhere. They're not in all neighborhoods. They're not as many neighborhoods as we'd want them to be. And they're not always as robust and as strong as we'd like them to be. But then there's this third kind of emerging category that's come about maybe in the past 25 years, where we have basically special assessment districts, where all the property owners, often sometimes commercial property owners, will pay a special assessment, like a homeowners association fee, to pay into a neighborhood improvement district. And so that neighborhood improvement district will complement city services, trash collecting, wayfinding, protection, security, to make certain areas of a city more attractive. And so I say corporate entities because in many cases, these organizations can be affiliated with a development group, a marketing group, something that's very popular or important. So one of the ones that I interacted with the most is Center City, Philadelphia, and they have their own kind of business improvement district, which also functions a bit like a neighborhood improvement district, and is essentially a corporate entity, and it does not have much of a connection to local residents in the ways that a CDC would. And then, just there's a greater description of that. So one of the things that just, before I start talking about Detroit a little bit more specifically, one of the biggest things, and I just hope that those of you working on these projects will think very much about, is this challenge between, in community development, are we more worried about the process, or are we worried about the outputs? And by that, I mean, what do we define as success in community development? Is it that we renovated 10 homes? Is it that we built a new supermarket? Or is it that we had as many people involved in the process as possible, and that we created a process where people could feel included and have their input considered and embedded within what we plan to do? This becomes a real challenge, because I think as kind of neoliberalism has shaped what happens in community development and neighborhood planning, that's become the schism, and that to attract the dollars from foundations and other people, we focus much more on outputs versus process, because process can be so expensive and so difficult to do based on history and mistrust and other things. It becomes much more about outputs. So I'm not going to answer this question for you, but I will just kind of leave this as, for you to answer on your own in your own practice and emerging practice. What matters more to you? Do you want to make sure that you understand the full dynamics of what's going on by having a very robust process where you understand all the dynamics of what's going on, including talking to people who don't come to community meetings, who don't want to talk to external kind of actors like people like us? Or do we want to just have the quick win? And what's the gray area in between those two things? People like outputs. They like to see that new housing has gone up. They like to see new streetlights and flags on streetlights, flags on street poles. They like to see this. But does that actually improve the quality of life, or is it lipstick on the pig? I'll just leave that there for you to answer. So about Detroit. Those of you who have, I know that in this series, you're going to be talking to a lot of people who have perspective on what happened in Detroit. And I want to connect it to community development in very particular, because I think this context matters. I want to end with talking just for a second about racial capitalism. So there are lots of theories about what happened in Detroit. And so we can think about the construction of interstate highway system and how it facilitated suburbanites to leave the city and still come into work. How government mortgage assistance programs helped whites move to the suburbs and avoid the city. How blockbusting and redlining really made investment in central Detroit neighborhoods much more difficult. Grassroots conservatism, where whites tried to defend their neighborhoods from African Americans who wanted to integrate into better neighborhoods with better housing, and how they have punctuated moments of challenge in Detroit. That you have we talk a lot about 1967, but by the numbers, 1943 was actually much worse. It set the stage for 67 and really what happened, particularly after 1970. And so it's something to be said for how all of these things work together to kind of create a particular narrative about Detroit that makes Detroit useful to people in particular ways. And I'll get to that in a second. I like Thomas Segru's from his book, Origins of the Urban Crisis. I like his, if you've never read any of his work or you haven't read Origins of the Urban Crisis, his preface to his second edition, I think, is really the greatest kind of palimpsest of his argument, that you really want to look at these three things that led to the Detroit that we understand now. This economic restructuring, this movement of manufacturing jobs out to the suburbs, and the suburbs actually limiting how African Americans could access those jobs because of where they were located, workplace discrimination that made it difficult for African Americans to access the jobs both in the city and in the suburbs, and the disintegration of the labor movement, or the increasing challenges of the labor movement into defending worker rights and for negotiating different things like the integration of African Americans, but then housing discrimination and segregation. And that Detroit was unprepared for the kind of population change that it saw in the 20th century. And that led to all sorts of challenges, including what happened in 1943 and 67. It was really kind of very deeply connected to demographic shifts that made the city a powder keg. So two things that I just want to leave you with, and then I'll get to the racial capitalism piece. That there's a way of thinking about two different things that I've raised here about in terms of workforce development and very specific things. When you look at the geography of jobs in Detroit, it's actually really remarkable the ways in which the Detroit labor market is very bifurcated between very high paid workers and very low paid wage workers, and that there's very little housing in the middle for everybody else. When you add amenities, grocery stores, schools, all that, it makes it very difficult for middle class residents, white and black, to stay in the city or get attracted to the city. Of the high paying jobs that the city does have, so many of them are filled by people who commute in. And very few of those high paid workers live and work in the city. There's a huge cluster of cohort of discouraged workers, people who just, because of barriers, access to a car, training, disability, et cetera, just don't have, and also work history, just don't have access to some of the good jobs that do kind of emerge in the city. So one of the solutions is thinking about the ways in which Detroit is so isolated in its metropolitan area from the suburbs. And so you can talk to Joe Grains and thinking about the regional planning efforts and thinking about transportation and how that's actually a social justice issue, to think about how can we get people in the city out to the suburbs where the jobs happen to be, and how that can have an effect. But then on the housing side, there's some really pernicious problems tied to the quality and availability of housing within the city. And this is tied to all sorts of things. It's tied to, kind of long-term population loss. It's tied to this missing part of middle income workers. It's tied to the supply and kind of how the supply has either been demolished or not maintained, and new housing hasn't come in to replace it. And then with individual households themselves and kind of lack of access to capital, having credit scores and disposable income to actually put down payments on houses and to maintain them, even if they had access to them. And so I want to put a little caveat. This is Hoving's, and from their report, they talk about lease to own options. I'm a little uncomfortable with that suggestion in particular because of the prevalence of contracts in Detroit. And in the questions, I can talk more about that. Some of their suggestions focus a little bit too much on fixing the household and not the system in which they're embedded. And so, there's that there. But I think their point is still, their analysis is still sound in thinking about what does it mean to address both workforce development and the quality and availability of housing in Detroit to make neighborhoods actually great again here. So the racial capitalism piece, I'll just end on this and we'll open it for conversation. There's all this hubbub right now about critical race theory and critical race theory. Oh my God, critical race theory. Yes, critical race theory is still a thing. However, I think legal scholars have actually moved on a bit to revisit Cedric Robertson's definition of racial capitalism, and that's actually in some ways a more important lens for looking at why things are the way they are in many American cities and neighborhoods, and that there is this extraction based on identity. And so the best way that I can operationalize is that there are people who profit greatly from Detroit being in the condition that it is, not just in terms of extracting rents, tax write-offs for land that they're not using and fallow land that's sitting there, they use it as a tax write-off, et cetera. But there's also using Detroit kind of its challenges as a narrative for why housing is so much better and maybe overpriced in places like Oakland, or this is a very sensitive subject for me at the moment, Ann Arbor. What does it mean if the narrative of Detroit as being this dangerous, dysfunctional place didn't exist, and the prices in places like Ann Arbor would come down because of how powerful that narrative is about how terrible and dysfunctional Detroit is? That some people are actually making a lot of money building fortunes on that, not to mention speculators, landlords, politicians who benefit from this narrative that Detroit is wonderful. So in a way, you're extracting value not directly from maybe a Detroit resident who's paying you rent or land contract, but also from just your own residents in Oakland County who want to be insulated from Detroit, and that becomes a problem. So I want to just suggest that redefining Detroit neighborhoods as complex places where very happy, dynamic, wonderful people, maybe not controlling their future, but have some greater influence over the direction of their community, means that we get to fight racial capitalism through how they get to be empowered. And so I want to just end on this note, and Anya and I don't know, Anya, how much we want to say about this, the work that we've done with the museum project, that we've encountered a lot of people, I won't say any names, but who benefit from kind of exploiting Detroit in a way. And so I've been surprised, at least in our project, the extent to which, yeah, I know Detroit, I can speak to it. And it's like, can you? And so, can you, or do you want to bring people who know better forward to speak for themselves and control their narrative? And then in some ways, how do we change the dynamics for who gets to tell the story and how they own their story? And so I would complicate the University of Michigan in this in the ways that we have a very particular relationship with the city of Detroit. And I know Marie brought some of this up in her lecture, in that we are a part of a system, a university that has a very particular relationship with Detroit. And so I think that makes it important for you as architecture and planning students to think very carefully about what type of engagement can we do in Detroit? What does it mean? And are we participating in racial capitalism, kind of benefiting from Detroit without actually delivering something in return? And how do we bring other people forward to do that? And I'll just give you a very concrete example of how this can be done. One of my colleagues in the public health school, Barbara Israel, she's very intentional that whenever she talks about Detroit, she's very, very careful to always, when it's a project about a particular neighborhood, she brings someone from the community that she's worked with and that she knows and trusts her with her as a co-presenter every single time. And so it's rare for her to present on her own about work she's doing in Detroit. And so I think that's one of the ways that we can think about complicating this relationship as a university with Detroit, and think about how that actually fits into this schema of racial capitalism. So I will stop there and we can have, let me do this first. I'm going to skip this because we can do this later, but I do want to mention these two courses. This fall, I teach this every fall, but we've changed the schedule up a little bit this year. And so my race difference and social justice in the American city class, we read everything from legal scholarship, sociology, history. We do read the gamut of things. And so we will take on things like racial capitalism, critical race theory, whiteness as property, but also racial capitalism, and how planning and architecture, urban design are implicated in some of these discussions. The neighborhood planning and policy course, which is going to be taught in the winter this year, is much more about the history of particular, topics in neighborhood planning, neighborhood versus community, neighborhoods of propinquity, Dirk Golster's work, Alan Malik's work, sociologists and other people, but also the history of particular programs like Model Cities, the CBGs, Community Development Block Grants, other things to help you understand how neighborhoods are either aided or impeded by government policy at the local, state, and national levels. So I will stop there. And Anya, I guess, do you want to facilitate a Q&A here, or should I?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I invite Neil, Jacob, Maria, all of us will facilitate this conversation because the breadth of what you just presented and the speed with which you presented relates to our projects that we're working with students on in very different ways. So there might be a plethora of questions coming from us, but I also encourage the students to please participate first and foremost in this conversation, should you want to engage. And if you're shy, just type something into the chat and Jacob will magically read it. With poise and great diction. Okay, just Harley, to maybe to kick this off, the beginning of your presentation, you made a call in many ways for an alternative to modern ideas about city development, and that there is a bottom-up possibility that's more inclusive, that is more nuanced, that's slow cooked, but that can come up with alternate variations to the way we've imaged or diagrammed or inflected the way our spaces are built. In the Detroit context, sometimes the critique of that kind of strategy is that the better it works, the more post-democratic our systems may become, the more dispersed, and the less our governments and our organizations are responsible for delivering services and systems. How do we begin to grapple with this, despite all of the different scales at which the students are working?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because it's, like, what part of the elephant do you bite off first? And I think one part of this is re-examining the social contract. Like, what do we expect cities to actually do, and what are they capable of doing? And so I often think of the concept of like transaction costs versus conformity costs. We could be in Sweden or Norway and have higher taxes, but then the government could do a lot more. Or that means, or the transaction cost, which is we pay less in taxes, we expect much less of government, which means then we have to do it ourselves. And so that becomes the rub, which I think often in at least our society, and this is my own cynical view, we often want, the transaction costs without the work. And like, well, you can't have it both ways. Either you pay the trash fee and they take it away every week, or you figure out how to recycle and, dispose of your trash yourself every week. Like, you can't have it both. You can't, so there's something to be said for in terms of neighborhoods, which is what can the city actually do? And what is kind of it legally obligated to do? And how can you force it to do what it's supposed to do? And then where does the rest kind of come in? And where can you kind of draw a bright line between what, okay, well, now you said you're not going to do that. We got this part. What becomes tricky is that there are so many other actors involved. And so it's difficult to not think about foundations, others that are actually in some ways pulling puppet strings through what they fund. And to say, well, we're glad to fund this, but we're not going to fund overhead. Well, if you have a formal CDC, they have overhead, just as we do as a university. We have overhead. There are things that cost, like we have to keep the lights on. We can't write the grant proposals in the dark. So, but they get to determine what they want to fund. And so what's your caught? Well, they don't want to fund organizing and kind of capacity building. They want to build housing unit development and construction. So, okay, so what do you do? And so that becomes, when I talked about that schism between community development corporations, often you have, I would say, a little bit more cynical view, which is like, let's just kind of go for what let's go for what developers will partner with us on and what we can get grants for, versus this more long-term, slow-baked community development process. That's challenging because how do you do both? Some organizations do manage to do both. Some of them actually do figure out how to do both. But often they're large enough to have the capacity, like they have the bandwidth to be able to do both. But they have long histories, long track records, and trust with both, kind of philanthropic, community, city government, and their constituent residents. And that's those organizations are rare. I would say they're very rare. They're in the minority.
Thank you. Anyone else? I have so many questions. Specifically, bringing up something that you mentioned toward the end of your presentation, which was when you talked about Barbara Israel and the responsibility one has as a member of an institution with this level of muscle and gravitas, how one operates in real scenarios. And here I think about how, for example, architecture studios, even at the thesis level, they tend to be speculative. Mm-hmm. And in our understanding, planning capstones are more engaged in real world scenarios. Are there any lessons that we should take away from you as a pedagogue in terms of dealing with, in many cases, students in this group are encountering community partners for the first time and delivering outcomes to those community partners in real world scenarios for the first time? Do you have any advice for us as a
Yeah, and this is a little bit off the back of the napkin kind of thinking here, but I think once upon a time, a lot of planning schools and even architecture schools and even anthropology programs too, you didn't have a 15-week engagement with the community. You had a 2, 3, 5, 10-year relationship with the community. And every cohort would come, like every new cohort of students would come in and kind of, okay, the last year's group did this, let's now add this other piece. Let's revisit things. And so I think there's that, but that's more of a kind of pedagogical curricular policy discussion that maybe is too big for this group to think about in the summer. But I think if you are serious about this type of work where you want to work with communities long term, I think that then it behooves on you to kind of step out of the Taubman parameters and think about, is there a community in Detroit, like maybe I'm living in or I have a relationship within, that I want to have a 2, 3, 4, 5-year relationship with myself outside of the constraints of a studio or a capstone. And I develop a relationship with them to offer my expertise and develop that. And so I don't think you have to wait on me or any other planning or architecture faculty member to facilitate. You can do that yourself, and maybe with our assistance. But I think that's where the trust kind of gets built and where people actually develop respect for you. Like, you're not just here for a grade or a publication or tenure or graduation or whatever, or a fancy letter that's going to get you to a new job or a better school. Like, you're here because you actually care about the future of these people and this space. And so I think in that way, you can actually empower yourself and empower them by creating a deeper relationship and actually doing it. Now, given how busy we all are in this space, that's a question, and we're 45 minutes away. Like, okay, so when do you fit that in? And so that becomes a question of how committed are you to that kind of project. And so I think some people are and they do. But I would just kind of issue the challenge of, can we kind of break out of that mold? And we can think about the larger kind of curricular policy about, like, maybe we do have multi-year kind of clinics, capstones, studios where we kind of go back to the same communities for several years in a row and really develop something, a long-term relationship.
Harley, I have a question about how this concept of community development and this bottom-up planning, this long-term, long-form relationship building works on a regional scale, right? So regional projects were often the role of a regional planning, project is convening voices across multiple contexts. And how do you do that bottom-up empowerment without removing agency or agenda-setting power? Because you're convening people from a broad array of contexts. Thinking specifically about the Great Lakes Way project, where you're dealing with communities both in Detroit, but also up near in the Thumb. And those are completely different contexts of communities to bring together. So I don't know if you can maybe speak to how this works with larger projects.
Yeah, so I would say there are two things. And so I would read Alan Mallett's The Divided City book, because he actually makes a call for exactly that. Like, how do we think regionally, and just see the neighborhoods as basically kind of cells of the larger organism, and kind of where are the places of common concern, both in the city and suburbs, and sometimes, like, kind of peri-urban, kind of, not quite suburban, kind of ex-urban places. But there are kind of issues of common concern between those different spaces and kind of how you convene that. He doesn't really give you a recipe to do it, but I then look to Resilient Boston. So I grew up in Boston and knew it to be a very, let's say, racially challenged place. Let's just say that. Boston's history of racial relations it's not a good one. But in the past couple of years, the city of Boston has convened a series of meetings about how do we actually engage Boston's really tricky racial history. That we're not going to move forward as a city in a region and think about things like sustainability and resilience and climate resilience until we actually take on, our racial history. I would say if we import that to Detroit, I mean, I don't think that there's no way you can kind of get Dearborn, Inkster, Romulus, Detroit, Ann Arbor have a conversation until you deal with the race question first. There is a really difficult racial history between these, kind of Ann Arbor, like those in-between spaces between Detroit and Ann Arbor, and north of Ann Arbor and Oakland County, Macomb, that are really challenging. So I think that there's like, you can't, personally as a Black man, I do everything in my power not to ever drive through the city of Wayne, never, because I've never driven through and not been stopped, not one time. So, so how are we going to plan there? If we can't even drive through. I mean, so there's something to be said for, and I don't look threatening, at least, those of you who know me, well, some of you, but, I would just say that there's something to be said for what does that mean to do some racial reconciliation, because, we do need to talk about climate resiliency. We do need to talk about development and transit, because, I think that the Regional Transit Initiative has failed 19 times. Like, it's insane, and how we not kind of locate race in the middle of that as a reason for some of or all of those failures. There you go.
Thanks.
There's some super comments in the chat coming in. Neil, I don't know if you want to unpack that at all, but I think it's really important to talk about or try to understand the subtext and the code for terminology when the word neighborhood is used versus the word community by our partners. I think that's, I don't know, Neil, if you want to add.
Yeah, it's well, I put that in as a little bit of a prompt to the students working on those.
Uh-oh.
Oh no.
Or a community center, right? But the things that they were talking about were how they related to the other objects around them. A little bit about their internal programming, but they were more about their context as needing sort of assistance. And then the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy, maybe it's because they have the thing, but they were then really eager to talk about the communities that use the thing. And that thing, stretches across many different literal neighborhoods. But they were like unabashedly like trying to sort of expand ideas of community, right? It was a little bit scary how easily they were able to just imagine different communities using their work, and so they wanted us to sort of think in those kind of conglomerations as well, independent of neighborhood.
I mean, I think it makes me like bristle a little bit when I listen for a particular intonation when I hear community. And so I think sometimes when I'm in less of a good mood, it's like, okay, so what do you mean by community? Who are you talking to? Who are you talking about? Because it's kind of like, you're applying for a job and they're like, we're all family here. And I'm like, that's a red flag, because it's really, are we family? And so I think community gets used in the same way to kind of gloss over kind of beneath the surface tensions. And it's like, are we really a community? Who are you actually talking to? And I mean, specifically, give me some names. Who are you actually talking to? Because that becomes the real challenge, which is how deep is your engagement, or just, okay, you attended a meeting and you can say there's a community here. People are willing to come to meetings, so there's instantly community. No, it's not that simple. I wish it was. It's not.
I have a question just about, and again, Neil is working on this project, so he would be able to speak to this better than I would, but we're working this summer with Sandra Enriquez, who came from
Mhm.
Boston,
Yeah.
who's now the CEO of Detroit Housing Commission. And she describes sort of, how does she describe it? She wants to turn the DHC into a performance-based organization, which suggests, like, to your point about community-based organizations focusing on means versus ends, and like the schism that you were describing, she's like, based on that comment, she's focused on ends for, I'm not sure exactly why. I can, for a number of reasons. It seemed based on what you were talking about, or the way you were talking about it, that you're suspicious of ends-based operation. The project that the DHC, the students are working on with the DHC, is about the kind of like providing of agency to the tenants of Detroit housing, and kind of like giving them a voice. A lot of them are uncomfortable speaking up because they feel very privileged to have a space. And so when Sandra was walking through these different apartments, she was like, if there are a number of issues that you should, like speak to us about. And so the project this summer is really about like creating some sort of infrastructure to humanize both sides of the equation, to like employees and tenants. But again, this sort of gets to, maybe it's in part about like length of time that we're working with them, but also about like what the focus is ultimately, means versus end. So I don't know how much of a question that is, but it's something that
No. I actually have a response to that. So I mean, so number one, let me just say, and I'm not just saying this because we're recording, I'm a huge fan of Sandra's. I really like her, and she and I have had this conversation about the DHC, and I think in some ways, coming from Boston, she came here to an organization that she felt was a little bit stagnant, and she was like, I need you all to understand, staff, how important it is that we get this right. That there are people living, in kind of insect infested apartments, kind of leaks, mold, etc. Like not performing on their behalf isn't an option here. And so I would separate that out from kind of performance-based measures for a CDC. I don't think that we can, just because it's, of and for and created by community, doesn't mean that we don't get that performance measures. Maybe we're not building 50. I mean, sometimes the 50 housing units is a good goal, and that is something we should be doing because it's needed. Should it be the only thing we do and use that as the only measure of success? Like, oh, we have a staff of 25. Oh, we built 50 housing units. We have a budget of 5 million. Are those the metrics, or that, hey, this community that employs us is very aware of what we're doing. They're in agreement with what we're doing. They're questioning and challenging us to be better, to do things, to hear them. And we have 25 staff, 50 housing units built, et cetera. That it doesn't have to be an either or, but I think, one thing to be said for city government, and, I think city government gets a bad rap too sometimes, that we expect them to spin straw into gold. That we don't support city government in the way that we should, because we're kind of like, I don't want to do these, conformity costs, and I want to pay taxes to support the city and to build the capacity that it needs. At the same time, expect them to be magicians. Well, it doesn't work that way. And so we have to, help the city do its job by voting for people who actually want to support city government becoming what it can and should be. And so I think hiring people like Sandra, who've had experience across the country in doing different jobs, can come here with a different perspective and say, hey, can we do better for residents of public housing in Detroit? Yes. Are we going to get it perfectly right? No, but can we just inch in that direction, or stride in that direction? Because that's what's needed here.
I think this might be a wrap. We've really benefited enormously from your perspective and from the energy and from the critical approach to the terminology we are just beginning to use in this course and in our practices. So huge thank you, Harley, for taking the time to guide us along and for the conversation that you facilitated and helped us with. Thank you.
I hope it helped. Good luck with your projects.
Watch out, we might be tapping you for more. Thank
Thanks,
you so
Harley.
much. Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. Take care.